Thank you, Nate, for taking the time and joining me on the show today. I appreciate you coming on. You are on the founding team and the head of growth at Royal. Prior to that, you were a partner at A16Z and an entrepreneur before that as well. But Royal's doing something really interesting at the intersection of music and Web3, two things that I personally love. And allowing people to invest in their favorite artists. We'll get down into down into things later on. But I think before we get into things, for you to share your story for those who don't know you would be the best place to start. Sort of how you grew up and your story from where you started to where you are today, and some of the decisions you made along the way.
Yeah, my name's Nate Jones. As previously introduced, I've had the very good fortune of being able to be involved in the intersection of technology and culture. It started with culture, specifically music, at an early age. My dad was virtuoso guitar player and also made guitars from scratch. And, out of my home was a workshop that serviced tour guitars for The Who, for Nat King Cole, for the Beach Boys, for a lot of music. And then even my stepdad, who was a growing in fame and popularity DJ in the 80s in the London areas where I grew up, and he was a serviceman, so he was American. But we had about 700,000 vinyls lining the walls of our home. So I was immersed in this coming up, grew up in this. I got into music through breakdance, hip hop culture when I was 8 years old. I was a graffiti artist, also used to win breakdance competitions. And then I got into writing myself, writing songs, writing rap music, freestyling, going to battles, winning battles. Eventually got signed to a development deal with MCA Records at 13 years old, which didn't go anywhere. But that was the beginning of my immersion, even from a young age, 8, 9 years old, being in South London, being in Brixton at the breakdance competitions, hundreds of people till 1, 2 in the morning. Being immersed in culture that way, was a special kind of education. And then moved around the world because my stepdad was military. So ended up being immersed in very many cultures, which was an advantage. I got a really diverse cultural education at an early age, not just music and culture, but just people in general. Lived in Germany, and then lived in the Midwest, and then recently in California. So I've had a chance to really live a lot of different lives and a lot of different experiences, in which I've been incredibly grateful for. You introduced me earlier as part of my career. I don't have a college degree, never been to college. Kind of got it out of the mud, so to speak. Found myself, running the streets, as a late teen, early 20-year-old, got in some trouble, did some things, had to figure it out, straightened out my life through tech. Tech was the first door that opened up to me, and gave me a real place as a young 20-year-old to, sell technology. So I schooled myself in it. I basically became my own college, and had doors open to me. And so, I've had a very, very, very fortunate career over the last 23 years. I'm dating myself right now, where I've been able to work with music artists, athletes, technologists. I've been in various roles, building companies myself or working as an advisor and helping CEOs and founders build their companies, how to understand organizational design, culture, go-to-market strategy, things like that. And all of this stuff is just basically me taking lessons learned, from the School of Hard Knocks and synthesizing them into, leadership lessons, go-to-market, business development lessons, and lessons on how to relate to people. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's really all about. That's what all this is really about, is how we relate to people. So that's my quick intro.
That's a great intro, and I appreciate you sharing. It's certainly a bit of an untraditional path for other people in your shoes now, starting companies in tech at the forefront of crypto and, A16Z partner, things like this. Everyone's story is unique, but I think yours is, particularly unique. I think growing up all over the world must have given you a really interesting perspective. And, it was interesting in prepping for this conversation to realize that music has really been a huge part of your life since like very, very early on. I think you said 8 years old, and say several 100,000 records going on in your house.
Yeah, I mean, it looked like a vinyl library in my house at one point in time. We also had all the TDK reel to reels, several techniques, 1200 uh, turntables, Newmark mixers. I mean, you name it, man. I mean, we had it. Obviously, we had boom boxes. We had lots of cassettes as well. We woke up in the morning and my dad was always digging deep into the crates. My stepdad was. Previous to that, obviously, I was a little younger, but I did remember, times when, very famous people would come to our house and we were in the, government housing outside of London. So it's they call it council housing. So, it's in my DNA. At one point in time, I was even, singing in church. I was like leading the choir. At other times, I was out in the street battling people, rhyming and battling people. So I've had a diversity of experiences with music and how music is used to transmit energy between people. And it really has a transformational power and can be used in many different ways, but it's music is life to me. And it's how people relate to each other. I think hip hop has been incredible in its ability to help people bridge the gap, especially I feel like in the 90s, 80s and 90s, you saw a lot of cultural translation happening through hip hop music that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And I feel like the art form itself is very magical.
How do you think about the development and evolution of hip hop over time? Obviously, you've been, following along and a part of it for, a couple decades at least now.
Mhm.
I grew up, more in like the 2000s and stuff, but in high school got really into like 90s rap in particular, like Tribe Called Quest, Souls of Mischief, people like that.
Yeah.
And then more recently, have come to appreciate modern artists, Kendrick Lamar, J. Cole, whoever it is. But I think it's really interesting. Like, I have a very different story than you, but I also sort of took inspiration, I feel like, through high school from some of those 90s rappers. And just there's like sort of a hunger in it and a hustle to it that to me sort of is motivating and just making yourself a better person and finding yourself a better life. So, I mean, I guess there's a couple of questions in there. One is like sort of how you think you were influenced from an early age, but secondarily, just the transition and evolution of the industry itself. I'm curious how you see it, having been, a part of it way earlier than I was.
So you brought up Tribe Called Quest. And one of the earliest memories I have is watching Africa Bambaataa and the Soul Sonic Force on a documentary that made it to us in VHS in England. That's how culture came to us. People from the States would send us stuff, VHS, stuff like that. So Africa Bambaataa started the Zulu Nation. And the Zulu Nation, Tribe Called Quest, members of the Zulu Nation. Now, the interesting thing about the Zulu Nation is they came out of a gang in the South Bronx called the Black Spades, which is who Africa Bambaataa was a leader in this gang called the Black Spades in the 60s, early 70s. And it transitioned into something very positive. So it really took kids out of that lifestyle and brought them into this sense of belonging inside of hip hop culture. And the Zulu Nation has been legendary, if not underdocumented in their impact of the early scene and also in the 70s, the early scene also into the 90s. Some of these bigger name artists, especially out of New York City, but it did spread outside of New York City as well. A lot of those guys would provide security at the functions because it was still dangerous in the South Bronx. You remember in the 70s, New York City went bankrupt. So all city services were kind of on pause, especially in the boroughs, especially in places like the South Bronx, especially in East New York, like Brooklyn. And so these kids were trying to figure it out. And so a lot of times when you talk about inventiveness, the thing I love most about hip hop is that they made something out of nothing. And it's the ultimate story for anyone who really pays attention to what the culture of this thing is that it's aspirational. You know what I'm saying? Like you can make something out of yourself from nothing. Those kids would jack power from the light poles. They would jack power, wire up a park, and throw parties. And these parties would keep kids out of trouble because they run these parties from like 8 p.m. to 2, 3 in the morning off of power they jack from these light poles, and they would run these street parties, block parties, sometimes in the park. And that's where the MCs were born. That's where the DJs were born. A whole culture was born out of kids that wanted to stay out of trouble and wanted something more positive to do in an environment that was essentially bankrupt. So I've always felt like hip hop is entrepreneurial in essence, but also a very strong medium because it's spoken word, it's poetry, but it's also something entirely different. The beats, they activate the lower chakra. They're very energetic and spiritual. If you think about it, the reuse of sounds and melodies, chopping them up, relooping break beats, the Recording Academy didn't even want to recognize hip hop until, the late 90s, early 2000s. And it had already become a global phenomenon going back to the mid 80s when Run DMC hooked up with Aerosmith to do a remix of Walk This Way. But, hip hop was still struggling to become recognized by the elites. And I don't think, that's not lost on me that something can go global without the stamp of the elites. And I really, really, excuse my French, but I really have always fucked with that energy.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great like sort of perspective. I should have known in bringing up like some of this stuff and some of these old artists that I like to listen to that I'd be getting way out of my water way quickly. But you obviously live and breathe all this, and I just imagine that your sort of knowledge of the history and the cultural impact and everything is just you can just hear sort of your passion in talking about it. When you think about like, obviously you've been following music and passionate about music for so long, but finally going back, I don't know, maybe a year ago or so, and you finally have this opportunity to connect some of your, career, the things that you've excelled at over the course of your career in business and entrepreneurship, and investing and all the like, getting users and building a great product, everything like that. And you have the opportunity to match that at what seems like sort of, an excellent time, and join a company that's looking to innovate at the intersection of music and Web3 and crypto. What was that opportunity like to you? Was that something you had in mind for a long time? And of course, I'm talking about the company you're working on now called Royal, Royal.io for people who want to go check it out. But that opportunity must have seemed like sort of it fell out of the sky in some way. I'm curious, sort of the genesis of finding out about that, and it's a considerable risk, I think, to leave A16Z. Great place to be and go and work on this thing that's certainly not guaranteed to succeed. So I'm curious, sort of how that fork in the road came about.
Yeah, so it definitely didn't fall from the sky. I saw Web3 coming from music a mile away. I've been have the fortune to work alongside or with some of the early founders in crypto, Roham and those guys at Dapper Labs and Fred, Brian, Coinbase. All of these folks I work with because of my work at Andreessen Horowitz and, helping them put together partnerships or introduce investors, angel investors that are from the culture. Famously, we were able to be a part of the conversation between Nas and Coinbase early on back in 2015, 2014, I think it was. And that's been a very publicized investment for Nas's team. Shout out to Anthony Saleh, who's an amazing investor and smart person. He's helped manage a lot of Nas's business affairs, but Nas is very forward thinking in his own right, obviously, an innovator. who thinks very differently about the world and about music and about culture than most people do. And so just being able to be a part of that, being a part of the conversations between the NBA and Dapper Labs that became Top Shot was a big part of that, those conversations early on, just seeing, how this has evolved. Non-fungible tokens, you brought that up in the meetings, we brought it up in meetings in 2015 and 16, and people were like, what is this? Is this going to be something? And then you fast forward to the pandemic, and the pandemic was kind of this coming of age awakening to what these things can be. And we're still not fully aware or awake broadly of what the possibilities are here. I think we've just only broached it. But property rights on the internet, or rights in general on the internet, right? Something that represents my ownership in different things, whether it's digital or physical property represented by a token, that's a powerful concept. Because if you think about the history of economic mobility, at least in Western countries, has existed largely around property rights and the financialization of property rights and all the things that go around them. And so being able to unbundle property rights into smaller pieces that can give me an entryway into ownership in the new economy, to me, that's a powerful concept. And if you think about it today, you can look at all the assets that are only accessible by wholesale buyers. And what I mean by that is like upmarket buyers who have huge asset holdings and huge bank accounts to be able to acquire these assets. In the music industry, typically that's big players, Hypnosis, KKR, Primary Wave, people like that, who go out and buy these catalogs for these iconic artists. But then you go further downstream and you think, okay, maybe I don't have to be an iconic artist. I just have to have a pretty good fan base. And also, I don't have to go looking for wholesale buyers. There's retail buyers. My fans represent a whole retail audience that hasn't been able to access these assets in the past. To me, that always made sense to me. So, when I met JD at a party and he started telling me about Royal, and then he started recruiting me, you're right. It was a very risky thing for me to think about at the time, because I had just launched this fund at A16Z called TXO, where the whole premise of that fund was to go after cultural geniuses who are locked out of the system. In other words, like, we wanted to kind of find the next Virgil before they become Virgil. But you can't look in the existing places. So you can't look at Google, ex-Googlers or Stanford grads, or you're trying to go outside the network to find genius that isn't common. And so I built a fund around that, and it was starting to work. There's some great companies that came out of that TXO fund. And so, I was very engrossed in that work. And so to pull me off of that after, we had toiled for like a year and a half to get that off the ground. We raised about $15 million for the first fund. It was moving. And so, but at the same point in time, it was too compelling to think about this moment right now, which is, I didn't want to miss a part of what I feel like is something that should be a part of my own story, which is to bring the culture to Web3 in this way. If you look at the history of the music business in general, Black artists and executives were always historically disincluded in the early days. And that's why you have very famous entrepreneurs that built big labels from the ground up, Def Jam notwithstanding. Sylvia Robinson, who built Sugar Hill Records, one of the first Black-owned records, was owned by a Black woman who went and canvassed the neighborhood as her own A&R to ask the kids who was hot, and signed some of the biggest names in hip-hop history that got this thing started. That was Sugar Hill Records. That was Sylvia Robinson doing that. You can go back 30 years prior to that and look at the Chitlin Circuit, which was an entire tour circuit that had to be built due to segregation through the South into some parts of the Northeast, like DC, that area, but mainly in the Southeast. And it had its own financialization, like it had its own like payment systems. They had their own venues, their booking systems, their agents, managers. They built an entire infrastructure and economy to be able to service Black musicians who couldn't tour in white venues at that time. And so when you think about the history of of African Americans, especially in the music industry, you look at a huge share of the value of the contributions to American history through music that have been recorded by Black artists, and then there was no ownership there. So for me, it was exceptionally important that if I was given an opportunity to break into Web3 at the intersection of music and Web3, that I do it, because we need to be in those spaces early on. And then I made sure to try and open up as many doors as I possibly can once I got in as well. Shout out to Letitia Johnson in the company as well. Shout out to Lawrence LeBlanc, who's also in the company. It was very important to me for those reasons. The history of this music, the history of this art is not lost on me. And I knew that this was a moment. From a Web3 standpoint, it was definitely a moment, as I said, understanding the history of property rights and the access to economic mobility.
Yeah, wow, that is a really interesting sort of breakdown of how you navigated the situation. I didn't realize actually how fresh your new fund at A16Z was at the time, and appreciate sort of how difficult that must have been to sort of realize, like, well, I'm really excited about this thing I'm working on. It's just starting to get off the ground, but this other opportunity comes up, and to have sort of the clear eyes and, just the reasoning that you just laid out to identify that as an unpassable opportunity and to go for it, I think shows, sort of just soundness of sort of perspective, and then also just the courage to go after it. Before we keep going down the Royal path and talk about the exciting things that you guys are working on, I want to take like a bit of a tangent to what you were talking about, you were trying to do with the TXO fund at A16Z. You talked about like sort of discovering the next Virgil. You're not looking at Stanford or Google to find that type of person, to find that type of genius. You have to go where no one else is looking. And I've always been really interested in sort of like talent identification, I would say, and recognizing and appreciating talent in sort of places you wouldn't expect to find it. Like as a silly example, almost like, one thing could be like a street performer you see somewhere, and like people aren't even stopping to appreciate the music, but it's like really, really good. Or, you're at like a restaurant even, and the waiter or the waitress is just like doing an unbelievable job at their job, which, most people don't really like appreciate. Like a waiter's a waiter or a waitress is a waitress, but I just like to see like excellence in anything that anyone's doing. I think it's pretty admirable. So I'm curious, like, when you were thinking about, launching with that fund, what were some of the things that you had in mind in terms of strategy and approaches to identify, to find that next Virgil? Was there any like systems or things that you had in mind as, to guide as like guiding principles to go and to hopefully be successful in what you guys were aiming to do?
Yeah. So the one thing is to understand that competency is largely a social construct. We build systems, like entire companies are built on this social construct, LinkedIn, for example, right? So competency is largely an agreement of different people and different networks that somebody is good at doing X, Y, or Z. Silicon Valley has mastered the art of understanding what technical talent looks like, even elite technical talent that's going to be able to solve very, very hard, sophisticated technical problems. The problem is, though, is that you can build all of this crazy stuff, but if no one is there, it doesn't matter. Like, look how long it's taken when you look at the adoption curve of let's say Web 2 mobile versus VR. The total install base of VR headsets, even with Facebook, one of the biggest companies in the world, behind it, is minuscule in comparison as far as both install base and speed of adoption. If you look at mobile from 2007 to 2014, when it was the fastest growing period of mobile for Web 2, devices were being just churned out and people were adopting at a large scale. VR doesn't even come close to that. And that's because there's no audience there. They still haven't figured out the killer app that's going to bring everybody onto VR, even though like VR is an exceptional experience, right? What's been solved there technically for you to be able to have the experience you have in a Quest headset is an unreal amount of research, investment, technology, like development, like that's an insane amount, right? And so what Silicon Valley doesn't do very well is they don't really have a competency around why human beings adopt certain things or don't. Right. And so that's why Silicon Valley companies, starting about 6-7 years ago, started really focusing on influencer marketing. They started going after celebrities to endorse the products. It's kind of a hack. Try and get the culture kickstarted behind some things. Some of this stuff worked, some of it didn't. Some early stage companies, and I worked on some of these projects. They paid a lot of money or equity to celebrities and nothing really happened. No one came, no one cared. Other times, it was the shit, or at least was for a while. And this is kind of the paradox Silicon Valley has always had, especially the bigger funds, around the bifurcation of the assets that they invest into between enterprise software or SaaS or whatever it is, or consumer, because you've got two different problems to solve. With enterprise, it's a pretty much defined path on go-to-market, sales, BD, operations, retention, all those kinds of things. There's a playbook's pretty much been written. But the consumer playbook is always changing and evolving because consumers are always changing and evolving. And also consumers are extremely, extremely fickle. And so how do you capture culture? Well, one thing is for sure, like, you have to start in the early days of a company. You have to start at the ground level of a company. Companies that are built with Silicon Valley ethos in mind around the technical prowess of the company, it's fits and starts trying to later on get people to even give a shit about what's been built. And so our theory was there's this whole class of geniuses that are not technical geniuses, they're cultural geniuses. For some reason, they're able to get people's attention, get people to care about what they're building, and get people to want to associate with whatever they're building, because it essentially is an identity creation. And so there are certain people who are very genius at creating new identities for people to assemble under and organize themselves. And if you can organize identity, joint identity, then you can also organize markets. And if you can organize market, then you have market power. And that'll buy you enough time to build the right product. And so essentially what we've done is we've said there's only really one way to build a company in the new world, and that's with code. But that wasn't right. There's two ways to actually crack the node. The other one is by consolidated interest. And so if you can get somebody that knows how to consolidate interest and build new identities, they can essentially build market power that gives you time to catch up on the technology, because people want to be associated so much that they don't care that the product isn't great yet. So where do you look for people like this? So, I had a few different theories of places you can look, but essentially it's like all of these cliques, like you look at the ASAP clique, designers and rappers, and there just seems to be these little bubbles, like OVO clique, like obvious stuff like the big stars, but there's also like this whole like ecosystem of people and creatives because creatives attract other creatives. Creative energy is very attractive to creators. And so wherever that energy is, there's going to be a lot of them. And so you're trying to find where there's these huge clusters of people, and then you're trying to find the creative geniuses who no one knows about yet, but what they're doing is so interesting. You can kind of see the engagement. You can see a little bit of it on social. You can just see their ideas, whatever they try, the experiments they try tend to be pretty successful. They might do a pop-up in the middle of Brooklyn, and that pop-up has a line going like 20 blocks deep or something like that, something crazy. And you're like, who is this person, right? There's all these little indicators that are not as easily definable, and they're a lot softer than what you would look for to measure technical talent. But they're not in Silicon Valley. They didn't go to Harvard. They don't work at Google. Most of them, may have went to a trade school, may have not gone to college. And so it's a very non-typical type of genius, which should be a typical type of genius. We just haven't created a mechanism for identifying it. And this was the whole thesis of the fund. Go out and find these people, shake the trees, talk to people who know the people who are cool, go and show up to these events and these different things and find cool things that look and feel cool and feel like they have an energy. And the same way you would make venture bets, make bets on these founders, and you make 100 of them and maybe 3 of them end up being the next big thing. It's kind of the same math, but it's a different approach.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I actually like I need to go back and listen to that a second time because it was like sort of a new concept for me. I feel like the pairing of the cultural genius with sort of the product and the technical side of the genius, and buying time when you have the influence over the market to find the product that matches it. It's just a very different way of thinking about starting something that I hadn't really thought of it that way before. So it's a little bit new and still downloading, but I think a reasonable transition to make without being too overt to get back to Royal is to ask, how are you thinking about sort of capturing influence over the market and people's, just broadly the consumers, um, with this new product that's a little bit hard to wrap your head around. It's not what people are used to seeing in the music industry. People still have sort of hesitancy around crypto. It's going to be difficult, I imagine. Not that it's impossible or anything, but a challenge that you guys are up to capture the market and have people get on board with this and change the music industry and bring people onto Web3 all in one foul swoop. So how do you think about sort of that when talking about the culture and things like that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to first think about how markets are organized and reorganized. And again, culture is a big part of telling people where to go and where the other people like them are and how to organize. I think a big part of this is the power of shared ownership. That's a huge, huge part of this. Ownership in the music industry is a loaded term, especially when you think about the history of the music industry. And so when you talk about selling people tokens that represent ownership in the streaming royalties of a song, you're right. That is such a new concept that some people don't get it all the way. Most people don't understand how the music business actually works. You have the copyright, you have the revenues generated by it. The copyright also covers derivative works. You're also looking at the licensing, which is when a movie or a commercial licenses the music. That also generates cash flow. And you're also talking about publishing. And all of these are different revenue streams for a specific composition of music. And so understanding that, it seems pretty complicated. Sometimes even artists themselves don't even know what they own, what they're owed. And so a big part of this is removing the opaque nature of the music business and simplifying it as much as possible for both the artists and the fans that are going to be buying their music. It's so new, you're right, that it is a learning, it is a part of our job is actually to be kind of teachers on what this means. And so we've taken on that challenge. A big part of any company, I think, in this era is to be kind of, a teacher around, what's new, what's being built, why you should care. But you're right. When it comes to music, I think for us, what's interesting is we've kicked off with some iconic artists. You think about it, Nas, Diplo, Big Boy, we've kicked off with some amazing artists. But I think what's interesting to me is, the future that we're looking at, where any artist can launch their music, sell their music, or the streaming royalties of their music to the fans directly without us having to curate. Right now, it's a pretty curated service. And I think what'll be interesting is when fans vote with their wallet on who should be the next hot artist, versus a semi-organic discovery model right now, which is the primary discovery model is like Spotify, basically. That's basically it. YouTube a little bit, TikTok is huge. So I think it's the 1-2 punch really is TikTok and Spotify. And shout out to my friend Anthony Brown, who's building a company called Breaker, which allows artists to distribute their music through influencers on TikTok. Really, really cool idea. And I think those are the two primary discovery models: playlists, official playlists on Spotify, or influencers who are sharing music, which has had the effect of both revitalizing old music to new, younger fans and introducing new stars. And so most of that stuff breaks there. The club is still the club. Stuff still bubbles up from the streets in some of these cities. There's a lot of cities that have a lot of secret influence, like Memphis. A lot of rap is coming out of Memphis that becomes big. The big cities are always going to be what they're going to be. But our job is, I think, there's going to be artists that break on Royal. And if we're really building something that's compelling, they're going to break because people are voting with their wallets and they're saying, I want to own a piece of the future. Everybody knows who Nas is. What if you owned a piece of Illmatic, a couple of weeks after Illmatic went live or was released? And then, think about that. 30 years later, now you own a piece of Illmatic, how much it's worth. That's really what we're thinking about, is people being able to buy what's next, not what's already obvious. And I think that's going to be the compelling thing. So as soon as we get to the point where we've got some homegrown stars that kind of built the financial layer of their career with their first believers on Royal, which enabled them to pay for their own bookings, booking their own venues and paying management and, really financing their own career to begin with. I think that's what's interesting to me here.
Yeah, so I know that you're a part of, if not leading, sort of the artist strategy, and you mentioned how like it's starting off as being curated, but you could imagine in the future it would sort of open up and be a platform available to any artist who wants to kick off and release tokens and not give away, but sell pieces of their revenues and their royalties from streaming and all these other things that these NFTs are allowing. How do you think about, there was a decision, I imagine, at some point to start in that curated fashion and to be strategic about, going with Nas as your first artist, go and get Diplo, Chainsmokers, Big Boy, Royce da 5'9", all these people, you guys have had on in the early days. But it sounds like there is a transition contemplated in the future where it becomes much more open and available to anyone. How did you guys sort of land on that approach, and that, if that's right, that it's going to be sort of a gradual shift from highly curated to very open? And while it has been highly curated in the beginning, how have you thought about strategically which artists to go after and everything like that?
So let me first say, an open marketplace has always been our plan, and that's coming. It is coming. In the meantime, we have to solve some very, very very, very sophisticated issues, technically, legally. There's a lot of things that you're able to do because we've built it that would be hard for you to do on your own as an artist. And that's what's coming. So, artists are going to be able to borrow our infrastructure to financialize their career alongside their fans. And it sounds simpler than what it is. And that's why it's taking a little while. And in the meantime, what we want to do is we want to show a great proof of concept. And so that's why we've been, we've had over 400 artists sit down with us in the last 9 months to talk about doing a drop. And we've been very, very picky because we want to send a real strong message around why the platform exists. And we've been very intentional about who we've dropped, why, and when we've dropped them. And very intentional about how these assets have been priced as well. We wanted to price the assets to really represent what we think is a balance between what the assets are going to generate and also the emotional value of the assets as well. These are not what I would compare to PFP drops, that are hyped like all the ones we know, Doodles and Monsters and Apes and Punks, all these things. These are not those types of economics from that standpoint. They're more attached to and tethered to the economics of the music business. And so that's how we've really thought about it. Nas was the perfect artist really to kick this off with, if you really think about it. Nas has been ahead of the game, ahead of everyone at least as far as rap music goes, music in general, really. Going back to Illmatic, look at the entire career, look at the entire catalog. There's so many iconic stories I could tell you. And we get into a whole podcast about Nas and why Nas has always been one of my favorite artists. Escobar has always been one of my favorite artists. Illmatic got me out of high school, honestly. We can get into that story if we want to. But All of these artists were chosen for a specific reason, to tell the story of ownership, and I think we provided a really good platform for that on each drop.
I'm gonna have to ask you and take you up on the offer to go into one of those stories because it sounds pretty interesting. I know Nas has been a big figure in your life, and now being able to launch with him as the first artist must have been pretty cool. Just give us an idea of how he's impacted, your trajectory in high school and on.
Well, yeah, like and I kind of shy away from getting into the hard luck stories because I feel like sometimes these things overshadow, and we become these underdog stories, and I'm very thankful for where I've come from, but I hate driving my story through kind of this sympathetic model people love, like these the pursuit of happiness type stories. But
Yeah, no, we
I
don't have
will.
to go there either, by the way. It's up to you.
Well, no, it's cool. I'll say this. Illmatic came out at a very, very unique time in my life. And the message of Illmatic was, here's this kid who's like he's rapping about what it's like to be in Queensbridge, which is the largest housing project in New York City. And also at that time, the most violent housing project in New York City. And he's rapping about what it's like. He had just lost his best friend, Ill Will, to gun violence. And he's contemplating, listen to songs like The World Is Yours. Somebody who wrote that song only months after losing their best friend, being that optimistic. So he would rhyme about the dreariness of and the dangerous nature of trying to survive while also dreaming of something better and tethering yourself to something better. And if you look at even his family, his dad was a musician just like mine, Oludara. He's a famous jazz musician, played all over the world. And man, I just connected with that. I dropped out of high school to take care of some business, to help my mom out. And there was a lot of situations where, home wasn't a good spot. I had to grow up very early and become the man in the household. And so when I went back, I was on the honor roll list. And that was because I stayed up all night catching up. And Illmatic was what I listened to do that. And it's really one of the first moments it kind of showed me that, like, you can self-motivate and you can kind of take your destiny. You got this manifest destiny. You can take it into your own hands. And that album was dripping with that kind of aspiration. Nas was an energy. It was an attitude. Illmatic was an attitude for me. It was like, you can acknowledge how hard this is without becoming a hard luck story by saying, hey, this is hard, but I'm going to get out of this because I'm optimistic. And fundamentally, I think a lot of that attitude is what's missing in the world today. Is there's a lot of discussion about how hard the world is, but there's a lot of hater energy now. And it's not as optimistic. We don't believe in each other as much. And that's to my dismay. Back then, it was like, yo, this situation is hard. But at the same point in time, we're going to make it out of here. Everybody, all of us together as a community. And I always really fucked with that energy. So that's kind of my take on Nas.
Well, yeah, I mean, Nas has certainly done that, and you have certainly done that. And I appreciate the candid story and just generally you coming on the show today and talking with me. It's been a real pleasure. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you do and what Royal has in store for the future. So thank you again, Nate. I know we're coming up on time, so I'll wrap things up here. I think that's an awesome place to end. But where can people go and keep up with, your story as it continues to evolve and Royal? Where do you want to send people?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter if you want to. I talk about all kinds of stupid stuff, some good, smart stuff, some silly stuff. Depends on what kind of mood I'm in, but it's at Nathan Jones. If you want to follow me on IG, it's at Nate Jones. That's Nait. Royal, obviously, you should follow at join_Royal. You should definitely follow Royal for all the updates. Same thing on IG. Follow Royal. And yeah, we're gonna have some really fun announcements in the next few weeks and months. So stay tuned because there's some dope shit.
Awesome. Thank you again very much. Really appreciate it. And looking forward to what's next and those announcements and wishing you guys all the best.
Man, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, man. It's been a pleasure.